Traumatic?
Traumatized, stressed.
Traumatic pneumothorax.
It was traumatizing, Michael.
Too traumatized. I think we're...
I was traumatized.
It was really traumatizing. I
feel traumatized, bruh. Leave some kid traumatized? I wasn't traumatized, actually.
That'll traumatize him good.
You think that's traumatic?
Never traumatize.
It was very traumatic.
Very traumatic for me.
Traumatize our daughter.
Traumatic stress, hypothermia.
Pre-traumatic stress disorder.
She gets traumatized for breakfast.
I was traumatized, Summer.
She's deeply traumatized.
Something extremely traumatic.
Butters is completely traumatized.
You should quit traumatizing women.
Her accident was traumatic enough.
Yeah, it was traumatic.
You're traumatized by the fact that
Post-traumatic, what's the...
being traumatized by horrifying sights.
Krabappel, he's traumatizing the children.
Traumatized by the incident.
I have post-traumatic ennui.
Traumatized is a strong word.
That was utterly traumatic.
Traumatic finger amputation.
To clear traumatic memories.
No traumatic brain injury is...
Pork chops look traumatized.
They said it would be too traumatic.
It's gonna be slightly traumatic.
Traumatized, dude.
Don't worry, Princess. Yeah, classic symptoms of post-traumatic stress.
Given the traumatic nature of the event.
You've been through a traumatic experience.
Nugs, we're so traumatized.
All of dehydration, post-traumatic stress, not getting...
Archie, you went through something deeply traumatic.
Here is where the children were traumatized.
Been through a traumatic experience.
The focus on post-traumatic stress.
You're so traumatized.
Georgette?
I thought those boulders seemed traumatized.
Girl who was traumatized by a horrific event.
You're suffering from post-traumatic shock.
The focus on post-traumatic stress.
Mary suffered a very traumatic experience.
Cases of traumatic or embarrassing death.
Clearly he's had a traumatic childhood.
And traumatic for you.
I only do...
This is gonna traumatize me. And I bet it's completely traumatized.
You've been through a very traumatic experience.
You've had a powerful traumatic awakening.
Be very traumatic for you.
But somehow this crazy traumatic shark experience.
Post-traumatic stress disorder.
I had a very traumatic childhood.
Traumatized co-eds are a sure thing.
My God, I really am traumatized.
A traumatic incident on the property.
This is traumatizing for the baby.
I'm sorry you got traumatized cards.
È stato un po' un trauma per me.
B, post-traumatic stress disorder from listening to...
I get dramatic, baby, yes, I know. But
They're less traumatized that they're unveiled.
Probably be somewhat traumatic for me.
Well, I guess I really was traumatized.
You've just been through a traumatic experience.
Inappropriately soon after a traumatic event.
For a traumatic loss, it's not uncommon.
He specializes in post-traumatic stress disorder.
We're in potentially traumatic times, but...
I got traumatized by those underpanties.
Post-traumatic stress is a real issue.
He specializes in traumatic brain injury.
When awakening from a traumatic state.
But anyway, I was traumatized and became...
But most importantly, traumatic brain injury.
They don't consider pre-traumatic stress.
But I don't have post-traumatic stress.
This is traumatic for me.
And the doctors call it post-traumatic stress.
You seem to suffer from some kind of post-traumatic stress.
You should quit traumatizing women with sexual intercourse.
Obviously traumatized and in a state of shock.
I'm not the one dragging traumatized passengers to interrogation rooms.
6 months ago, Spence suffered a traumatic brain injury.
Psychotic break was triggered by a particularly traumatic event.
You know, this all started with our poor kids traumatized.
You traumatize him. Is that what you want?
I was so traumatized, they sent me here.
These normal, non-traumatized people. In relationships, love.
Traumatic situations, it's not at all uncommon.
Okay. Well, from what we know about post-traumatic stress...
I realize you're still traumatized by the break-in.
She pressures me.
How traumatic for you. Scar tissue on...
I get it. It's very traumatic.
You're lying.
Must have suffered some sick, traumatic, dark event.
A therapist thinks it's post-traumatic stress disorder. What if something traumatic happened and you're blocking it out?
It was more traumatizing having to explain to my dad.
It was traumatic. It's been a couple of months. Maybe you remember things differently now.
Yeah, traumatic? Seth doesn't even begin to describe this.
He is traumatized, Mom. He is your boss.
Promising new treatment in traumatic brain injury. Damn.
It says the original circumstances of the injury were traumatic.
This is some traumatizing shit, you know that? It's a traumatic thing to be thrown up on.
What you went through, it was traumatic.
I know this has been a traumatic time. I
didn't mean to traumatize your young daughter.
From others suffering from post-traumatic stress, but
Assuming that there was a traumatic injury, likely a concussion.
His brain had been consumed by chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Wait, and you're not like traumatized or anything? Lincoln, you're home. Aren't you traumatized?
I think it's fine, but I also think it's traumatic.
I know this has been pretty traumatizing.
Her experience with the master must have been extremely traumatic.
Please, it's too traumatic for me to even say it.
Naturally, he was badly traumatized by the murders.
Do you have any idea how traumatic that would be?
Right. Well, we'll only mildly traumatize him then.
Traumatized after the whole Tyler thing.
Through a very traumatic situation, ma'am.
I had a traumatic experience after an open house.
I realize you're still traumatized by the break-in.
Top could be liable for traumatizing an innocent child.
Anniversary of an event brings back traumatic memories.
I've lost my identity. The result of a traumatic event.
Traumatic process to the body.
What you're demonstrating are signs of post-traumatic stress.
Of course I do. It's fucking traumatic.
A traumatized Steve Holt needs a father.
We purposely keep patients with traumatic brain injuries
And perhaps traumatized by a persistent random misfortune.
You should never traumatize a woman sexually. I should know.
I am a victim of fear. I've been traumatized.
Well, the sexual acts we like don't traumatize other people.
I'm not traumatized.
A man pointed a gun at you.
All right, well, if you must know, I had a traumatic...
You know why? It's not because it's so traumatic. It's
What's more relaxing than a trip down traumatic memory lane?
This must be a post-traumatic stress flashback.
Okay, Marge. As long as we're traumatizing the kids.
That's how we're giving elephants post-traumatic stress disorder. Well, I know it was a little traumatic for you, but
Cause of death appears to be traumatic brain injury.
When it comes to reassuring a traumatized 19-year-old.
You should never traumatize. You should quit traumatizing women with sexual intercourse.
I know. I saw it. It was traumatic.
No.
You've been through a very traumatic experience.
Or other traumatic brain injuries to turn volatile.
It must be difficult to see her so traumatized.
looks like post-traumatic stress is setting in.
I have helped policemen through some of the most traumatic moments of their lives.
What you did was very traumatic for Fufa.
Traumatized by the events of this week.
Looks like Milhouse has traumatic amnesia.
That's gonna be traumatizing for him. We should go down there.
I have Gulf War syndrome. I have post-traumatic stress disorder.
Having a father walk out on one's life is a traumatic experience, and
I'm forced to relive the most traumatic 2 separate days of my life.
What I did was I looked back to the most traumatic period of my life.
Well, when I was just a little boy, I had a very traumatic experience.
Dear God, Betty, is there no memory, however traumatic, you want to find?
Carlton, I know you're upset. You've been through a very traumatic experience.
Being in a room with a dead body could be very traumatic.
Look, that post-traumatic stuff he's talking about, that stuff is real.
And wrapped up for you. I think I'd be traumatized.
Bullshit. I'm not gonna let you people traumatize her again.
Just got out of a very serious and traumatic relationship, and
He thought a bumblebee had gone up him. It was quite traumatic for him, actually.
actually, my mom thinks I might have been a little traumatized by the whole.
Brain surface neurons in this area have also been traumatized.
No, it's too traumatic for him to engage with her physically.
One of our friends was raped in Peru. It was very traumatic.
This is what traumatized me. Such a meal to go to waste.
Oh, then it must be PTWRSD, post-traumatic war reenactment stress disorder.
That was really traumatic for me, but I'm hanging in there.
My husband has bad knees, a bad back, and traumatic brain injury.
Head back on. That can be very traumatic for these kids.
Yeah, you were.
Don't worry, Mr. Stutch. Whatever traumatized your son in his past, we'll find it.
It's clear you're a traumatic hallucination made manifest by my hitting my ego.
Your son appears to be suffering from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder.
Eric, you're just an image in my head brought on by a traumatic event.
I also know that my daughter went through a very traumatic year. And that you...
You don't think your son will think it's yours and be horribly traumatized?
While the team's waiting out front, we don't think it necessary to traumatize kids by kicking in doors.
Was I traumatized as a child that I had to turn to drugs to forget about it?
Yes, but something he saw on that mission traumatized him so severely